Hello, I'm Alexandra Harrison, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's Supporting Child Caregivers episode on good discipline with school-aged children. As I told you in our last episode, most parents come to see me with concerns about their child's behavior. They want help in setting limits for their child. And also, as I mentioned, the task of setting limits, or what I call good discipline, is actually very complicated and difficult. But surprisingly, if it's done well, it can be very useful, it can be helpful in growing the child's brain. Now, this is the second in a series of YouTube videos I'm going to be making on setting limits or good discipline. Last time we talked about setting limits with preschool children. Today it's going to be setting limits with school-aged children. And in the future, we'll also talk about setting limits on teenage children and children with special needs, for example. I'm going to remind you of the general guidelines for setting limits. The first is to validate the child's feelings and help the child get regulated. The second is understanding the meaning that the situation has for the child. And the third is responding with the appropriate kind of containment and learning opportunity. So in summary, it's validate and regulate, understand, and respond. So, in terms of the guideline number 1, validate and regulate, remember there are 2 steps for this guideline. The first is to validate the child's emotions, which can be very difficult to do when the child is misbehaving, but is very important. And the second is to help the child get regulated. And as we said last time, validating the child's emotions is necessary to make the kind of connection you need to make with the child in order to create a learning opportunity in this limit-setting business. Also, as I mentioned in the preschool episode, if the child is escalated to the point of being completely out of control, you have to help the child get regulated first before you can even try to empathize with the child's feelings. Remember Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain from the last episode? If the thinking part of the brain goes offline when the child is very out of control, then the emotional part of the brain is running the show, and negotiation is probably off the table for the time being. Now, the second part of the first guideline, which is to help your child get regulated, means to help the child regain a state of calmness. And you do this first by calming yourself. And then there are some other strategies you can use. If your child is out of control, you might help him get distance from what was provoking him in the first place, which might be you, or a sibling, or a problem that the child feels has overwhelmed him. And then you can take him to a timeout, for example, or a quiet place. Sometimes helping the child take a deep breath and counting to 10 works. These are age-old techniques, but the reason they've been around for so long is that they can actually work. Remember, it's only when the child is in an adequately regulated state that he can listen to you and take in what you're trying to say. Now, as I mentioned before also, it's not a bad thing to comfort your child when your child is very dysregulated, even if it's because he's behaved badly, because comforting is not spoiling. You can help the child experience the consequences of his or her behavior later on when they're calm. I want to point out again that this first step of validate and regulate is often skipped, and that is a setup for a bad result. Now we come to guideline number 2. We talked about how preschoolers make sense of the world in a wonderful way, which is full of magic. The adult mind has a very hard time stretching to understand it. Selma Freiberg called these the magic years, And early school-age children also maintain some of that magic. They still have some of that magic. But school-age children are growing out of the magic years, and they are able to think more and more like adults, at least until they become teenagers. And the good side to this is that you can reason with them. And the bad side is that they can argue, and arguing can lead to struggles. But struggles gives me the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite ways of discussing family situations, and that is to imagine that the family has a landscape. Every family has a landscape. This idea comes from a developmental science paper that I like a lot, and it describes all families as having many different landscapes, and within that landscape there are cities. So, for example, there might be a city that is a collaboration city. That means people getting along well together. Or there's a city that has to do with being polite. Or there's a city that has to do with being disengaged, not connected with each other. But this pattern in the city that I talk about most is what I call the struggle city. Now, family members interact to create these patterns, and as they do so, they establish what you could imagine to be the infrastructures of these cities, like highways and buildings and all the things that people need to live in a city. Since we know that the nervous system grows stronger through the repetition of an act, remember the old cliche, practice makes perfect, or the analogous neurodevelopmental maxim, neurons that fire together wire together? Well, we can easily understand that the more times the family goes to the struggle city, the stronger that infrastructure gets. The better the highways, the faster and easier it is to get into a struggle. Now, the struggle city becomes what we call in dynamic systems theory an attractor state, and it pulls the family members into it. For that reason, I always try to remind families, parents, to avoid struggles whenever they can. Suppose we take an example of a girl named Janie, whose mother has called her to dinner while she's watching a television program, and Janie says, "I'll come in a minute." But after 5 minutes, Janie's mother has to come back, and Janie is still absorbed in her TV program. At this point now, the mother has many choices. And the choice she makes will be influenced by, although not determined by, the infrastructure that her family has established already. For example, if the struggle city is firmly established as an attractor state in this family, her mother will likely become very stressed and angry and will come down hard on Janie. She may run across the room and snap off the TV, or she may say no TV for 2 weeks, or she may lose her cool even worse than that. All these responses, though, tend to escalate the situation and make it even harder to reach a positive resolution. Now, if on the other hand, the family has a kind of robust infrastructure in the collaboration city, in the getting along together and coming to terms with each other city, then her mother will not get so stressed. She'll trust that they'll come to a resolution, that to this conflict. She might say to Janie something like, "Janie, let's record this program because dinner's getting cold and you can watch it afterwards." But if Mother and Janie are either in the struggle city or on the way to the struggle city, this kind of simple, positive resolution to the struggle, to the conflict, might not even occur to them. Or if it occurs to the mother and she mentions it to Janie, Janie may blow up. They need the experience of having been there before and having made a positive resolution multiple times. Remember, practice makes perfect. That's why I talk to parents about practicing collaboration, practicing making resolutions to conflicts. And when that's too difficult, avoid the struggle. Sometimes parents tell me that the only way they can avoid the struggle is to let the child win. Well, this is a misconception that reveals the fact that the parent is speaking from within the struggle city or en route to the struggle city. The truth is that no one wins in a struggle. And if the parent can't think of a good solution to the problem, the parent can always say, we'll send it to the committee for further study. That's what the government always says, of course. This means the parent tells the child, look, I don't want to get into a struggle now, so we'll discuss this later. There will be a consequence. We'll talk about the consequence when things have calmed down. And if the child rebels against the consequence later on, it's another opportunity to practice getting to a solution. Okay, now the third guideline is the response. When a child misbehaves, it generates conflict with you, the authority, or another authority like the teacher or somebody else. And a good response to this kind of conflict is a negotiated one. For example, a negotiation in which the child makes a repair of the problem that he's caused or agrees to suffer the consequences of his misbehavior. You can try this method of negotiating with a preschool child, but it's easier with a school-age child whose cognitive capacity has grown and allows them to reason. Now, a very good negotiating method is described in a best-selling 1981 book by Roger Fisher and William Ury. It's called Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In, a proven step-by-step strategy to coming to a mutually agreed upon, mutually accepted agreement in every sort of conflict. Well, of course, it sounds easier than it actually is, but the ideas that this book offers, some of them are very solid. For example, the authors recommend separating out fixed from flexible positions in a negotiation. And the book identifies communication problems as central to the issue of resolving a conflict. An example of a communication problem they give is that one party incorrectly deduces the intentions of the other. In other words, they don't understand the meanings that each of them make of the situation. And that, of course, gets us to guideline number 2 of understand the meaning. Parents understand the meaning of the situation for the child. For example, Janie's mother may not understand the meaning the TV program has for her. Since Janie's very involved in the program, they don't have a chance to talk about it, and mother will have to wait till later. But when things are calmed down and mother is thinking about what kind of consequence to give Jamie, she's going to try to understand the meaning of the program to Janie. And maybe the meaning is as simple as Janie wants to watch the program and she's sick of her mother telling her what to do all the time. And that meaning might result in a consequence of some restricted TV watching. But on the other hand, it may be that Janie is watching a program that has to do with a scenario in which there's some conflict among girls that reminds Janie of some conflict she had with girls at school or online during the pandemic. And Janie wants to see the end of the program to see how the girls on the television program resolve that conflict. And if that's the meaning to the TV program for Janie, her mother may understand and decide not to give her a negative consequence at all. So this method of negotiation, which is a really good one, never goes perfectly, but it often goes well enough. And I think I've mentioned before a psychoanalyst named Winnicott who coined the term good enough mother to describe a mother who's not perfect, but good enough to give her child what the child needs to grow up well. Well, this method of negotiation is a good enough method, and it's what you should aim for. If you want to hear more about limit setting with school-age children, including dealing with arguing and the beginning of a conversation about the important subject of homework, listen to the SCC podcast episode number 9, where I talk about that. In our next SCC YouTube episode, we will discuss the very challenging issue of good discipline with teenagers. Thank you for observing. Thank you for viewing.